Okay. All right, so you got a notification that says Youri's returning the call.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1. This is yes, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on this All Things Canada edition, All Things Africa edition, we're joined by activist, musician, and contributor to the Canada Files Christian Shingiro. I hope I'm not butchering his name. And
Shingiro. You pronounce it Shingiro the Rwandan way, but you can say Shingiro if it's
okay. Perfect. How do you pronounce it then?
So Shingiro.
Shingiro. Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay.
So yeah, actually my full name is Christian Shingiro Muchaba.
Okay.
So
okay.
Yeah. That's the whole name.
All right. Well, if I try to butcher that one, I'm gonna butcher it too hard. So I'll stick with Christian Shingiro. And we're going to be discussing the findings and implications in 3 articles he did for the Canada Files. One on Congo-Rwanda, another on Ethiopia's conflict with the Tigray and secessionist forces known as the TPLF, and sanctions on Zimbabwe, which is going to lead us to an interesting conversation on the legacy, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the late Robert Mugabe. So firstly, Christian, thanks so much for coming on the program. It's an honor to have you on. And before we talk about Congo-Rwanda, tell us a bit about your background, because I know that you ran as a member of the CPC, Communist Party of Canada. You've also you also are a musician, and I know I've watched interviews that you've done with past guests Dimitri Lascaris, Arnold August, and even Daniel G of the Canada Files. So talk to us a bit about your background before we get into the articles you did.
All right, so getting into left-wing politics, basically up until my first time going to university, I was a liberal. So I actually did economics for about 2 years before I ran out of money and had to come back. And during that time I was doing economics, I'd watched a little bit of the Real News and discovered that actually Marx himself was an economist. You hear all these things about Marx. You hear conservatives wailing about Marx. It's going to be Marxism if you do this. It's Marxism if you do that.
Yeah.
And you don't really know anything about him or what he was or what he was about. And then I found out he's an economist. Okay, so let's look at his economic theories and understand him. So it gets you to look at Adam Smith, who was economist centering on labor, and then realizing the differences between him and Marx, and Marx pointing out an inherent flaw in the capitalist system. So that radicalized me, at least to, in any capitalist position. So I would read up stories, read up stuff like that, read up the Real News, and you start to realize actually that a lot of the information you get is still kind of skewed.
Yeah.
And I would still, be saying things like, China is still bad, Russia's still bad, et cetera, whatever.
Yeah.
Even if we're doing this, they're still bad, But that's kind of like the liberal washing off. Like I would read a little bit more, read a little bit more. I'd started getting into left communism, anarcho communism, some mix of those two positions as I was reading different philosophers and different theories. Right, and then at what point I'd actually ran into a particular guy on YouTube, and his name was the Finnish Bolshevik, and this was after I had gotten into Trotskyism, and I think his particularly interesting video was I think it was about an hour and a half long, and it would show like how Leninism is Leninism and Stalin was just continuing Leninism, and that Trotskyism was it's a completely deviant ideology. And he had pointed out key moments in history, key readings, key facts, key mentions from Lenin about Trotsky and Stalin about Trotsky, and you look at the history, and then it made me realize that I wasn't reading enough. I wasn't reading enough about Russian history, about what had happened, and I'd become a little bit better of a Marxist because I was able to defend the legacy of the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
At one, yeah. But that's not enough, because you'll still find yourself condemning the China of today if you don't read enough, or if you don't look at the context in which China did the things that they did with their economy. So afterwards, I actually looked at being more reticent and knowledgeable about what had happened in Rwanda, like my family's perspective of what had happened in Rwanda. I had looked at China's investment projects, and I noticed that most of, not all of them, were being done by state-owned enterprises. And you look at the economy and the way it's managed, it's actually still planned. It's still a planned economy, but it's using market forces to its advantage. It's actually achieving the supply meets demand equilibrium by eliminating patent monopolies and eliminating the things that I studied in economics, but with socialism to actually get that reality, not Austrian fluff.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So is it safe to say you're one of those Africans that's not afraid of a rising China, and China having not so much influence, that they're a rival imperialist exerting influence, but you see China's rise and them having more relations with African countries or even the continent as a positive, as opposed to we need to be equally scared of them because they're going to be rival colonialists to America, Canada, and the pan-European empire.
So both sides of schism is a non-argument. It's a way of keeping the status quo and maintaining the status quo. What they're really trying to say is we want to keep the same side, but we don't want to say it openly because we know what our side did. So there's China and the Soviet Union together have a history of anti-colonial support, supporting anti-colonial struggle and rising up from imperialism themselves. The Soviet Union came into existence after fending off 11 imperialist countries. China basically did the same thing with the conspiracist Kuomintang. And then after they got into power, they immediately started establishing relations with Africa better than the Soviet Union did. Both the Soviet Union and China armed and supported national liberation movements that ended things like apartheid. So the ones who were on the side against apartheid were the Soviet Union. In fact, there's a major scholar, a military historian that Ian Beddoes mentioned to me, and it was a good source and a good read on what the Soviet Union's perspective on apartheid was, and it was a very anti-colonial perspective, a very hostile perspective towards apartheid, towards Rhodesian. They called them racist states, and that's what they were. And they followed up their rhetoric with action. So
yes,
anyone telling me, yeah, so anybody saying with a straight face that these countries were bad historically for Africa and are going to be bad in the future, I just don't know the history. What they're actually afraid of is that Africans get smart and do what they did, because that's how they got free. They implemented socialism and got past their tribal differences and united on a working class basis and overtook the governments. That's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of Africa becoming free. And they're lying when they say that China is trying to subjugate Africa. What they're afraid of is that they'll learn from them and break free themselves.
Interesting, and I'll have to have you back on the program then to talk about China and Africa, because past guest on the program was Fiona Sim, who gave me and the audience an entire lengthy history. It's actually the longest episode of 1+1. It's practically it's nearly over 3 hours long, where they was explaining to me, Chinese history from a Maoist, Marxist, Leninist, post-colonial Marxist perspective. And when I asked the $1 million question today, and even when I had Jay Watts, former central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada, and brought up, how do you respond to the criticism of China being a rival imperialist? So even putting aside people who still call China a rival capitalist system, but China as a rival imperialist system, they said that there's just no evidence of that you can criticize China for maybe not violating the sovereignty of said African country and maybe being a little too respectful of other nations' sovereignty, but that there's just no imperial relation whatsoever, and China's not overthrowing countries left, right, and center because a country wants to nationalize a Chinese mining company, or that a country or that China doesn't like what such and such a country is doing, and if they don't follow their demands, then they're going to send either the military or do some kind of color revolution, because imperialism depends on economic exploitation, and it uses every tool in the book, whether it's divide and conquer or whether it's just brutal, military coups and whatnot. So ergo, China cannot be, a rival imperialist, country in Africa, in the African continents, right?
So I think even TVO with I think Brian Cohen, he pointed out with the investments that 96% of those investments are done by state-owned enterprises. And when you look at actually the private investments that are done, you'll find that a lot of majority stakeholders are U.S. companies. So that ends up being the punchline.
Yeah,
it is. It's the punchline. When we were looking at like those relationships, particularly in Congo, in Zimbabwe, you'll see like this is actually something that Max Blumenthal himself pointed out, right? On the gray zone, you'll see a company with a Chinese name, and then you'll find out actually no, it's majority owned by a U.S. company, and those are the ones that are implementing slavery in the DRC.
Interesting. Well, we're gonna we'll definitely explore that subject in another episode, and I'll even make sure to post in the links two very good interviews that the brilliant Ronnie Akalik of Breakthrough News did with an African researcher, part of Vijay Prashad's anti-imperialist left-wing group, and Kimbali Musavali of Friends of the Congo. where they talked about how no, China's not doing imperialism and neocolonialism in the continent, and Kambali, and then she also did a one-on-one interview with Kambali about it. So, but onto your articles. Speaking of Congo, so you did an article for the Canada Files, and the title of it is "Canada Sets Up Embassy in Rwanda Amidst Growing Mass Anti-Imperialist Movements in Neighboring DRC." So before you talk about that, I know Congo threatened late last year, I believe in October or November, that they would send its military to kick out Rwanda and its proxy forces, its accomplices and backers from the Kivu region, eastern parts. Any news you can give on that, and talk about your article regarding two nations, Congo and Rwanda?
So Tshisekedi is under a lot of pressure from FUPA, so the Front Uni des Patriotes Congolais. So that movement is what's forcing Tshisekedi to change his rhetoric to be hostile towards Rwanda. Because before, remember, he was a really close friend of Rwanda. He was hugging Paul Kagame, saying he's a great guy, he's good for the region. Even as his citizens were being slaughtered by his proxy movement, M23, early on. In fact, actually, there's an article in Black Agenda where they call Tshisekedi his house Negro. So Paul Kagame's house Negro. Precisely because of how friendly he was with them before. He's kind of a liberal upbringing of the opposition to Mobutu, and a lot of the opposition to Mobutu kind of profited off of the invasion by Rwanda and Uganda at the expense of the people, of course.
Exactly.
Where they overthrew Mobutu and and put in Laurent Kabila, and then Laurent Kabila, he went against. I actually have some information that he did something that was absolutely unacceptable to the United States, where he allowed the North Koreans in, and they taught militant groups like the FDLR, which is the opposition to Rwanda, how to build AK-47s from scratch. And after he did that, he got assassinated. He got gotten rid of, and his son was able to take over. His son, incidentally, right now is senator for life, because he knows what it's about, and he knows how to stay in power.
Wait a minute. Wait. Time out for a second. So Laurent Kabila, this bootlicker, this Rwandan, Ugandan, Western-backed bootlicker, when he had the stupid idea that he could run Congo, the way Mobutu ran Congo, without Western blessing. So he thought that if he if he could kick out Rwanda and get the North Koreans involved in it, that he would not be murdered by by the Western backed proxy forces.
It's kind of like what happened with Mugabe. It's like it's a Saddam Hussein situation where you think that as a puppet that you can do whatever you want, that you can become a real boy. But the fact is, you can't become a real boy. You have strings, and if you go too far, you stop moving. That's what happened.
Okay, so but then his son gets into power, and I guess and his son, learned very quickly. Okay, I don't want to go the fates of of my dad and even Mobutu before him, so I'm just going to go along to get along. And now he's senator for life?
He's a senator for life, yes. So he's senator for life.
Okay, anyway, so fascinating. But, okay, but yeah, explain your article and whatnot, and the current leaders then.
so Boswell Sekelm Silver is the leader of the Parti Communiste Congolais, Parti Communiste Congo. So that's the Communist Party of Congo, right? And he's really educating the people very well and teaching them what's happened historically. And as a result of that, it's growing a lot of anti-Western, anti-imperialist sentiment throughout, because the movement that brought Tshisekedi in power did not have class consciousness, right? It was just a knee-jerk reaction to Joseph Kabila and the suffering, and there was no clear direction. They just wanted change because what they were doing right now wasn't working, so they had to try something. Tshisekedi is changing his tone precisely because of people like Bosso Silva's education of the people. He's teaching them the truth. He's explaining what's actually happening, and he's explaining the root of this problem, how these guys got into power. He's showing what the M23 is, that it is a Rwandan proxy in every way. This is something that's actually known to most. It's an open secret. It's talked about on South African news all the time. That Rwanda is supporting the M23, and they're invading on a regular basis with their special forces. Like, this is looting, taking minerals here and there. Uganda is doing the same thing. When you look at the article, that was actually the whole point of putting them in power. Kagame actually outs himself when he talks about Frobedu. It's short for it's a left-wing Hutu nationalist movement in Burundi that had taken power at the same time that he took power, and basically after he had assassinated the last president, with the help of Canada, Belgium, the UK, all those people.
And just a quick reminder. Yes, guys, Paul Kagame is not the hero of Rwanda. He is the real butcher and genocide of Rwanda. He's the one that shot the planes down, and he killed everything and anything that moved.
And yes,
Hutus and Tutsis alike, and then invaded Congo to steal mining resources.
So to be fair to Paul Kagame, he killed Hutus, and he only really killed Tutsis that he considered traitors. The other ones, he would direct them to go into churches and hide while he massacred the remaining Hutus. So he was partial to Tutsis. So to be fair, he was partial to Tutsis.
Exactly.
But to be very clear, this was there was a genocide in Rwanda. It was a genocide of Hutus and moderate Tutsis by the RPF, Canada, Belgium, the UK, and the US, which is actually reinforcing the RPF supply lines, according to Ndimana, the general that Christopher Black successfully defended by pointing out these facts in court. He successfully defended him against a completely rigged human rights tribunal by pointing out these undeniable facts in court. Indeed, Liamana's forward operating troops witnessed U.S. Marines reinforcing Rwanda's supply lines.
Unbelievable.
Yes.
And yet at the same time
the RPF, I mean.
Yes, and yet at the same time people people are still at the same time people are still they still have what happened in Rwanda completely wrong. So there's a narrative that comes out about Rwanda that we need the West to intervene when supposedly a genocide is happening, and governments are being very repressive, when they simply don't realize that yes, that stuff was happening, but Paul Kagame was not your hero. Paul Kagame was not the savior, and the West knew completely what was happening in Rwanda, and it all went according to Western imperialists' plan and so forth like that. And then other people they do this bizarre thing, kind of like people who defend Israel. You'll have people who defend Israel and say, well, the Jews of Europe and so forth, they have been oppressed for all of these years. Ergo, they have the right to Israel and to dispossess the the Palestinians. And it's been shocking that you get that when you talk to sometimes people about Rwanda, including people from Rwanda themselves, those who support Kagame, they'll say things like, well, Kagame, he saved Rwanda, and after all we went through, we should be allowed to go to Congo and steal resources. There are some who openly say that, and some who basically justify the unthinkable just because of what supposedly happened to your response to that.
So one of the people that helped to perpetuate this myth, Romeo Dallaire, actually enabled the slaughtering of Hutus in stadiums, Stadium Amahoro, Gataba, these other stadiums. So they're active participants. They have blood on their hands. Like, they slaughtered these people, and you'll find that when you find actual dictators responsible for mass slaughter, like for example, when Robert Mugabe killed 20,000 people in a village that Joshua Mkoma came from, the West actually rewarded him for that. They established diplomatic relations. They they opened him up to the World Trade Organization. They started doing this and that. So actually, he got rewarded for slaughtering 20,000 people. This is the truth. They're not there to help these people in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. When the people actually fight for their interests, they get brutally punished for that. And that's what sanctions are. Sanctions are actually an organized act of punishing the people for fighting for themselves. That's what it is.
But before we get to Zimbabwe and the complicated legacy of Mugabe, explain to us what's going on though with Rwanda right now, because there are people who do speak. There are people who, when they are brave enough to speak out against Paul Kagame, they're brutally ejected from whatever university or whatever place Paul Kagame and is telling his lies. Even when people who stupidly think that Romeo Dallaire was the white knight savior, but when they say to him, but Paul Kagame has been suppressing his people very brutally, and he has blood on his hands in Congo, how can you still defend him? He either just does not answer it, or somebody is just again ejected out. So now with Congo threatening to kick out to kick Rwanda and all of its accomplices and proxy forces out of Congo, is there is this going to happen? Is it inevitable that it'll happen as long as the Congolese anti-imperialist movements, which you say is growing in Congo, demands that of their president, and so answer that, and then talk about how it's clear that Canada is not going to be supporting Congo because they're opening up new embassies in Rwanda. So talk to us about that.
So the Congolese army, the truth about the army, it's been corrupted from the very beginning.
Corrupt.
corrupted from the very beginning. Actually, a Congolese ambassador, he went to the UN, and he pointed out the fact that I think all of the major leadership was Rwandan. All of the major leadership of the military was Rwandan, and this was a result of bringing in CNDP, bringing in people from M23, integrating them into the forces. Yeah, they had done all of this with the help of Joseph Kabila and Tshisekedi, like when he was a friend, really when he really liked Kagame and Museveni and these people. And Museveni is the one who started this whole thing, by the way. It's actually like
Museveni, Youri Museveni, who's the Western-backed Ugandan dictator of Uganda.
Yeah, he's the one that that built the RPF and had them invade Rwanda in the first place in 1990. So from 1999 to 1994, that's actually what it was. It was an invasion by Uganda, because they still had Ugandan army tags at invocation when they came in, led by Paul Kagame. During that whole 4-year civil war, when they were breaching ceasefires by massacring people in the village here, there, throughout northern Rwanda. So this is actually the truth. The Congolese army is corrupted by design. It doesn't make any sense that a country that's small like Rwanda can terrorize Congo. It doesn't make any sense.
Exactly.
The reason why it's happening is precisely because of that. It's because the official army is totally corrupted. What's happened now is that people have taken the initiative and take up arms for themselves. In fact, actually, I'd read a recent push off of the M23 was done by the Front Uni des Patriotes. So they actually fended off and fought off the M23 from a village recently, and that was them. It wasn't the army, and it's not likely to be the army anytime soon until that government in Kinshasa is overthrown.
Interesting.
And it looks like it might end up coming to that point. That's probably what you'll see first before anything gets resolved in East and West Congo.
So do you think there's a possibility where even if the people of Kinshasa are apathetic to what's going on in Kivu, but do you think do you think that if enough people protest in Kinshasa, and of course if we see a lot of people power protests going on in Kivu demanding Rwanda get out of Congo, that we actually could see hopefully a breaking point and a tipping point, and maybe maybe even depending on who's going to be a sincere African actor, that Rwanda will be kicked out of Congo once and for all, hopefully.
Well, I mean, one thing I can tell you about is this Tshisekedi and whether he's sincere. So this whole thing, if you think about it, orchestrated by the U.S. Paul Kagame is trained by the U.S. What did Tshisekedi do along with Haikanda Hichilema, the president of Zambia? At least Hichilema, he's a little bit more open about his pro-U.S. stance. So it's a little less shameful for him to be doing what he did at the U.S.-Africa summit. But when they went over to the U.S.-Africa summit, which many communists said that it was shameful that you even went there, but they went there. And Tshisekedi and Hichilema actually signed off their rights to cobalt in a memorandum of understanding. So you're giving a gift basically surrendering to the people that are terrorizing you. When he invited the East African community into the country at about maybe about July, early July. This is after, you know, senators had come by and wrote out like an understanding with Rwanda about, you know, partitioning. Congo was actually like a letter that's open, so they made an agreement about this. East African community was the whole thing was funded by the European Union. It was funded by the European Union, and the largest troop contribution was from Uganda. And that was after the Congolese government was awarded about $300 million in compensation for what they did to them during the Congo Wars. So you're getting compensation for a military occupation that had happened that caused all this damage, all this harm to the people. You're getting maybe about $300 million in compensation from a government for invading you. And then you invite them to invade you again. That's basically what they've done. So
the Congolese military won't be our savior, but it's up to the Congolese people themselves to be protesting, and an anti-imperialist movement and organizations devoted to the overlooked continent of Africa, and that's where Black Alliance for Peace and anti-imperialist organizations and in Canada, that's where they can come in to step up and help, right?
So look, I'm an Orthodox Marxist-Leninist, and it's vindicated basically by the history I'm researching, finding, and discovery about Africa and all of these leaders, including, Mugabe, where he had key members as part of the Capricorn Africa Society, which is basically a colonial British project instigated by the founder of the Special Air Service, David Sterling. So this whole thing tells me that workers need to organize themselves into a revolutionary Pan-African Communist Party, and they need to do what the Russians did and what the Chinese did. If that's actually the thing that the people terrorizing them, the NATO and these other countries are afraid of them doing. So if they don't want them, the Africans to do that, and if they split up borders, manufactured imaginary ethnic groups, if they've done all of this in order to make sure that that didn't happen, then I think Africans should say, okay, so they don't want us to do that, we should do that. And I think it's good to see that, particularly in South Africa and a lot of parts of Southern Africa, where that history is there, the anti-colonial struggle is there. People are, thinking and putting things together, especially in West Africa, like Mali, for example, and a lot of places that were, ravaged by French imperialism. If they're all thinking, you know what, I think we need to do what they don't want us to do, which is, to build a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist party, because they don't want us to do it. And that's what I'm thinking, based on what I'm seeing, because every leader that I've seen so far has shown huge problems. Tshisekedi, he basically asks the foxes to guard the henhouse. That's been his strategy since he got into power. He's given his cobalt away to the architects of this disaster in the country, the United States. Even in Zimbabwe, they still have these very predatory and harmful, mining and company relationships with the same countries that are sanctioning them. So what does that tell you? It ends up, that ends up being what my conclusion is. is maybe
Well,
there's a reason why they didn't like what
it's
China did.
it sounds like we need a pan-Africanist Marxist union, not the African Union. So that's a perfect segue. Before we get to Ethiopia, then that's a perfect segue in which to talk about this other article you did. Tell us about how the ruling Liberal Party, but also even much of the opposition or fake opposition in Canada is supporting the TPLF in Canada. And if you could explain, and if you can, do explain how this came about, this conflict between Ethiopia and Tigray. Please explain because that's how the TPLF are in the wrong. And I ask because the Red Review, a podcast which is associated with Socialist Action Canada, my comrade and twice past guest, Daniel Terade of the NDP Socialist Caucus, he was speaking to a left-leaning Canadian, Tigray, who accused Ethiopia of genocide and was saying that Canada was being complicit by supporting Ethiopia. And I have to respectfully disagree with that because from what Ann Garrison has been reporting and what Breakthrough News has been reporting, it's just the complete opposite. The imperialism is against Ethiopia, not is against Ethiopia, and we're backing again reactionary forces of the TPLF, which is basically a pseudo left wolves in sheep's clothing type of organization. So to explain what's going on.
Okay, so Abiy Ahmed, believe it or not, there's only a small sliver of truth in what she's saying, because Abiy Ahmed is actually somebody that the West liked when he got into power initially, because he took basically the socialist infrastructure of the country that was established by the Derg and began, selling off assets, selling off this thing here, selling off there. So they liked him and they gave him the Peace Prize. This is everybody knows, it's an open secret. Nobel Peace Prize is controlled by NATO. It's not a real Peace Prize that's based on actually trying to bring peace into the world.
Exactly.
It's just something to put on a headline to bolster Western propaganda. That's all it is. So Abiy Ahmed got that, and it was for making peace with Eritrea. So that was something that actually was seen as somewhat of a good thing to the West up until Eritrea had
up until they started getting along.
Well,
which Ann Garrison thinks that is why there is this bizarre divide and conquer that the U.S. is trying to do in Eritrea and Ethiopia, because the West loves it when the Horn of Africa and the continent is fighting each other as opposed to being united and going, hey. So yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. Like the peace being made with Somalia, the establishing the region of kind of like a peaceful accord, the Belt and Road Initiative with China. So interesting infrastructure projects with China were allowed under the TPLF, which was a known puppet of the United States. The TPLF saw their opportunity with, basically the overall hostile policy of Canada and the U.S. towards Eritrea. And they attacked Ethiopian troops. So they started this war. They attacked Ethiopian troops in Mekelle. And then they fired rockets in Eritrea. So this war was started by the TPLF.
But
no argument, no ambiguity about it. And when they were in power, they acted as a minority puppet regime that was brutal towards every other ethnic group. They actually will openly talk about, a lot of TPLF supporters will openly talk about a sense of superiority over the other ethnic groups. the other, which are really just cultural identities. Because if you look, there's a lot of similarities between Oromo, Amhara, Tigray, and Tigray, Tigrinians are the same. They're the exact same thing. They're actually the majority in Eritrea.
But
so yeah. So they're all the same thing. It's the same thing. A lot of the TPLF supporters, by the way, are from Eritrea, and they speak the language of Eritrea. So this thing about Eritrea committing ethnic violence against the people of Tigray is like saying that black people have gone in to kill black people in Mississippi or something like that, or they've gone into.
But you were saying, though. But you were saying, but you were saying though that this Canadian Tigrayan who claims that there's genocide happening to the people of Tigray and that Canada is supporting a genocidal Ethiopian thing. You're saying that there's a half truth to what she was saying about the Nobel Prize winning Ethiopian government, who's now having to deal with.
It's not even a half truth. It's the only small part is that they used to like Abiy Ahmed. They used to like. That's the only part that's true. Is that they used to like.
Elaborate more then for us then, and talk a bit more about that.
Abiy Ahmed, because unlike Eritrea, he's neoliberal. So the multi-ethnic organization, it's a liberal thing, neoliberal thing, and he implemented neoliberal reforms on the socialist economy, on socialist infrastructure. It's no longer a socialist economy, but on socialist infrastructure. The TPLF, what they did with it was they just used it as a slush fund to rob. They looted $36 million from the $36 billion from the government, and it funded these large multi-million dollar nonprofits all over North America, including Omni Tigray and these other ones. It's like worth tens of millions of dollars. This money from Ethiopian coffers, from Ethiopian taxpayers. They looted them and robbed them blind. That's the truth. Like that's what that is.
But that's so fascinating within itself. So allow me to understand this, because Ethiopian history, and of course when you throw Eritrea in there, when you throw Somalia in there, it gets very complicated sometimes to follow all of this. But so during the time of the Derg, which oftentimes was very brutal. Oftentimes it was a very brutal Marxist project. You had this kind of state within a state, which was the TPLF, which had some left elements, but had its own problems, because it sounds to me as if they were ethno-nationalists, and the West was kind of playing, again, divide and conquer. So they did not support the Derg. They really did prop up the TPLF. Once the Derg, dissolved, and Ethiopia had one Western puppet after another, and as you mentioned, the current president, the West loved him for all of his neoliberalism and making peace with Eritrea, but for whatever reason, they're not liking the cooperation. They're not liking him wanting ties with China. Ergo, it's time to prop up, secessionist forces and use the G word, genocide, and try to overthrow him. Have I gotten that correct?
So, like for the most part, with the Derg, the flaw with the Derg was the Derg failed to recognize, language rights, which is a normal practice among most Marxist-Leninist countries' projects. The Eritrean Popular Front for Democracy and Justice was led a lot on the lines ideologically by Marxism and Leninism, and they allied with the Tigray People's Liberation Front only because there was a failure to recognize language rights by the Derg. What had happened afterwards, during that whole struggle of the Derg in power and the opposition, what was going on there is the TPLF started engaging in these very underhanded tactics of stealing food aid, blaming it on the Derg, whatever there was starvation going on, when they're the ones exacerbating the famine, right? It's the same thing that they did throughout this whole conflict, this current conflict.
Yes,
where 400 trucks.
It's been reported that the TPLF have been attacking humanitarian aid ships and whatnot.
They actually take there were about 400 trucks sent into the Tigray region at one point during this conflict, and the Ethiopian government allowed them in. What happened to the food? Where is it? Because there's starvation going on in Tigray during those 2 years, for sure. And what I'm sensing is that part of the major motivation for going through a peace deal was that they were caught. They were caught this time. It's not like where they were able to get away with it before with the Derg. This time they were caught. And the thing is, though, it's very calculated. They're very calculated, and they understand their international partners. It's actually a word, incidentally, that the MDC's Fangira used to describe his partners, international partners. They understand the pariah government they should be targeting, and it's Eritrea, right? Even though it makes no sense historically, it makes no sense actually. The majority, like I said, the majority are Tigray in Ethiopia. In Eritrea. They really are. But it's the same thing. Tigray.
But going back to your article and the title of your article, Canadian Parliament privileges pro-TPLF advocates, smears pro-Ethiopian government advocates. So it's simply not true that Canada is supporting genocidal Ethiopian government against the TPLF. No, Canada is supporting TPLF secessionism, ethno-nationalists. That's who Canada is supporting. Canada's always supporting the most reactionary forces in Africa, right?
Well, yeah. Think about there were genocidal acts of war that crimes that they committed during their tenure from the time they got into power after the Derg, I think 1991, up until 2018, when the people have finally had enough and just kind of had a knee-jerk reaction and put in the liberals, right? With the TPLF, when they were committing these atrocities in Somalia, and when they were massacring people in their own country, there was no mention anywhere. In fact, the U.S. always seemed to congratulate the TPLF for their efforts in counterterrorism. If it's no, to be honest, if the ones that are really slaughtering Africans on a regular basis are the ones being rewarded. Museveni, for example, Kagame. Yes, yes, yes. Leader of Guinea-Bissau. You know, that's really what it is. Mugabe, when he committed that massacre of 20,000 people, he got rewarded for that. He got rewarded for that. It was
And
white people that he got in trouble.
One last question about Ethiopia before we talk about Mugabe. Do you think that this peace deal between Ethiopia and the TPLF is going to last, or again the anti-imperialist movement, the peace movement needs to be very vigilant about the possibility of, the TPLF and its Western backers screwing over Ethiopia, breaking a ceasefire, and another war breaking out sometime?
So I read a recent report that they actually they're beginning to hand over the heavy weapons. Of course, they're complaining about Eritreans there. Saying that, they're committing all these atrocities. That they're, trying to ethnically wipe out, their cousins and their family members. Because actually, that's what the truth is. It's like they're very interlinked. Eritreans, majority of them are Tigray. Like, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. That's the truth. And this thing about going after Eritrea, it's all ideological. It's all from the fact that the Eritrean Popular Front for Democracy and Justice refused to engage in the neoliberalism that other African states did. They stayed independent. No IMF loans, no World Bank loans, none of that. That's really what it is. So it's not because because of any particular atrocity in Tigray that they're being sanctioned.
So let's not hold our breath and let's be ready for the next Western attempt to sabotage peace.
I think that Tigray's surrender is sincere because they have surrendered their heavy weapons. So they're beginning to surrender their heavy weapons just because I think people have realized that Ethiopia shouldn't be the target among the the imperialist thinkers up in the top strategically. In fact, actually, Trump wanted to make deals with Abiy Ahmed before, precisely because he was neoliberal.
And the final topic on Africa before before we wrap up, and I actually want to talk to you about the state of Black Lives Matter and Native Lives Matter, in Canada and the U.S. But before we talk about that, let's talk about Robert Mugabe, who and Zimbabwe, who which has come up a lot in this conversation. So you did another article for the Canada Files. Canadian sanctions on Zimbabwe launched after failed NATO plot to install the U.S. military base. Now, we don't have to even talk specifically about this article. I'm going to make I am going to link it. What I wanted to talk more about, talk a bit about the article, because now I was surprised to learn that even with Robert Mugabe dead, that there are still sanctions on Zimbabwe. Now, explain to an audience, which I know for a fact largely sees Mugabe as a person who was once upon a time an African hero, but later he became the evil pigs like an animal farm and became, an oppressive dictator. Why should we be opposed to the economic warfare sanctions on Zimbabwe? And what's your assessment of Mugabe's legacy, the good, the bad, and the ugly? Because I have I'm curious your views, and then I'll express my my assessment of Robert Mugabe.
So when Robert Mugabe murdered 20,000 people, the Commonwealth rewarded him for that. That was a way of actually getting rid of Joshua Nkoma's support. So that was part of ZAPU. And it was ensuring that the ZANU-PF and the Capricorn Africa Society aligned people are in charge. And incidentally, actually, you know, Mnangagwa is close friends with a mercenary from the basically kind of like a mercenary who used to work for the Rhodesian government, like white mercenary. Yeah, so Dick, and he's close friends with him. And that's actually what they liked about them. What they didn't like was that they surrendered to the will of the people, which was the will of the people to get the land back. So when sanctions are imposed on these countries, the sanctions are not about punishing the regime. That's actually not even what the purpose of it is. They say it's about punishing the regime, but it's actually about punishing the policies that are being implemented under pressure of the popular movement, the popular will. So, for example, when they sanction North Korea, it's because North Korea is implementing socialism. And socialism, by its very definition, is an economy governed by the workers, by the farmers of the country. So they govern how the economy and how the resources are being used. And it's the people acting in that way that they're punishing. And the people acting to defend themselves with nuclear weapons from the United States, which has carpet bombed their country before. So that's the thing that people need to understand about sanctions, what they are, why they're implemented. They're not being implemented necessarily to overtake a regime, although they would like that if that regime will act on the people's interest in a particular area that they do not like. It's particularly about punishing the people precisely for rising up against imperialism in a particular way. In this case,
so the collective punishment of sanctions, it is designed to punish the Iraqi people, punish Iranians, punish Russians, punish North Koreans, punish Venezuelans. It could be a democratic country. It could be a socialist democracy country. It could be a right-wing country. It could be a theocracy. But they are designed to punish anyone who's not being a bootlicker for the imperialists 100% of the time, no questions asked.
Yes. So the sanctions on Iran, for example, are punishing them for building up a military capable of defending themselves and for nationalizing the oil. And those are things that were done under pressure from the popular will. It's kind of like a relic of what they wanted under Mossadegh. So,
exactly.
So in order to legitimize themselves, they had to do certain things. And, you know, the Ayatollah and the basically the theoretic bourgeois democracy that they have over there. That's basically what that is, and the planned economy that they have over there. So it's heavily state controlled, and it's planned economy, and the reason that they're being sanctioned is precisely because those are policies implemented under pressure of the will of the people.
So Robert, so getting back to Robert Mugabe, you mentioned that you mentioned that that it is true. Mugabe did commit atrocities. Mugabe did commit crimes against humanity, and I'm glad that you said that because I saw a documentary which was very critical of Robert Mugabe, which I'm going to link, and Robert Mugabe was a guy in which whatever good he did for his cronies. He did suffer from African sectarianism, African tribalism, and he was complicit in backing the West when there was the scramble for Congo after Mobutu was overthrown, which is why I have beef with him. And British declassified documents show that the UK thought of Mugabe as a very reliable partner and did not care about inner tribalism and inner rivalry that was going on in Zimbabwe. They only started to put sanctions on Mugabe, and he only started to fall out of favor with, as you mentioned, the Commonwealth, when he said, look, my country is still very poor. We still have millions of people in poverty, and it's time we have a redistribution of land and wealth. Poosh, he goes after the white farmers, and then that's when we have the reign of sanctions and the reign of sanctions, right?
So fast track was the government response, like they had to respond that way after after Mugabe's own soldiers and peasantry began occupying land. They engaged in a mass land occupation, and it ended up forcing his hand, and he had to do fast track because they were occupying the land anyways. So actually, yes, when you think about the context of that, the sanctions are deliberately punishing the soldiers and the peasants who took back their land. It's not punishing Mugabe. It's punishing the soldiers and the peasants who took back the land. That's what that is. That's what sanctions are for, and that's actually the intended purpose. It's to force people to, and in a way they consciously understand it as well. That's part of the reason why the regimes end up staying, is because when they make the point out, hey, look, they're punishing you for standing up for yourselves. And they end up saying, yeah, actually, that's what they did. That's what they did to us. And they understand that there's actually a tremendous amount of political consciousness around the world. I mean, a lot of people just say, oh, they're brainwashed, but they actually know. They know very well what's going on internationally. And they understand what these sanctions are about and what they're doing and why they're doing it.
But then if we look at Robert Mugabe's legacy, how do you respond to the criticism of Mugabe, which often comes from left-leaning folk in Zimbabwe and outside of Zimbabwe, who say, "Look, we do need a redistribution of land. We do need to we do need to empower the farmers." But they'll say that Mugabe went about it in an undemocratic, tyrannical way, whereas Bolivia or Jacobo Arbenz went about land reform, farm reform in a democratic, accountable way. How do you respond to those criticisms of Mugabe, that he was just a reverse racist who was only giving land to his own cronies, not the actual farmers who were exploited on those lands for however decades-long period of time?
So the land redistribution, not through his intention, ended up being a lot more fair than expected. When it comes to this argument about, oh, you should do things democratically like Bolivia, they couped Bolivia, a few years back, and then overthrew their government. Governments that don't get couped are always going to be demonized, but the way the governments are is why they don't get couped. It's a very silly argument, and it's a very hypocritical white liberal argument, to be honest. It's one of those arguments that you make from a position of privilege, who's happy to appreciate your democratic processes because you can go back to brunch after you've done your vote, and
And
you can look down on and poke your nose at these uncivilized people that are using force. They're using violence. These brutes, these Africans. But the truth is actually the truth is actually every state, there's no there aren't universal principles that are ever followed by any so-called liberal democracy or whatever. Every state will use force against the ideology and opposition to the ruling class. Every state.
and
And if it's a worker state, it makes perfect sense to suppress bourgeois ideology, and there's no problem with that. In my personal view, it's very ridiculous.
But then I imagine as a as a Marxist, but then I would imagine as a Marxist Leninist. Now Russia, when that grotesque feudalistic monarch was overthrown. Now, I'm not saying I endorse a lot of the violence and a lot of vigilante violence that came about, and there is no doubt that the regime was eradicated in a rather brutal way. And I'm not even talking about Stalin. I'm talking about when Lenin and Trotsky were in power. I mean, the argument that some people would make is that the Tsarist regime was so brutal that a violent revolution was only inevitable, especially when these serfs who had been oppressed for so long finally took power into their own hands. And Africa, which was called, which means to this day, the continent is still so brutally colonized by pan-European empires, Canada, the U.S. and so forth. That it's only inevitable that look, these people, when you do land redistribution, they're not going to give it up willy-nilly. So ergo you have to be like, okay, look, land back to the exploited African farmers. Your response to that?
So Canada didn't sanction Zimbabwe up until 2008, by the way, and the thing that triggered that was an election. The election, by the way, in which the opposition party got parliament. So they won parliament, but they didn't win the presidency, which is what the imperialists wanted.
Yeah.
And that was actually what their problem was, because they had a deal with Tsvangirai, and the deal was, according to Ian Beddoes, he was a member of Umkhonto Wesizwe. So that was actually the armed wing of the ANC during the anti-apartheid struggle.
Yes, yes.
He got training from KGB officers as an intelligence officer, and his position allowed him to know about what happened with South African intelligence, and they intercepted, agreement being made with MDC and the United States about establishing a military base in Zimbabwe, and that was what their problem was. That's actually their problem, is that the military base is going to be used, of course, by members of NATO, like Canada. Canada would be able to go over there and have, military training, partnerships. They'd be able to go over there, patrol, guard the minerals, and just be a force that kind of reminds all of the miners, who they're up against, So that's really what that is. That's actually what that was about.
But then my two final questions then about Mugabe's legacy and Morgan Tsvangirai. So Mugabe's supporters, were they right to say that? Were they right to say that? Look, I don't agree with everything my leader is doing, but do not trust Morgan Tsvangirai. He is a bootlicker for empire, and the only reason why the U.S. and the U.K. are supporting him is because there is a deal that's going on behind the scenes that's going to screw over Zimbabwe. So in other words, if Morgan Tsvangirai was to actually also pursue redistribution of lands and wealth, there's no way that he would have gotten support from the Americans and the Brits.
So let me tell you something. The MDC, they split after their infamous 2005 vote, where they voted against fast track. They voted against enshrining the land redistribution in the Constitution. So they voted against that, and that's exactly why they became a reliable partner for the West. And this is why Canada was really upset with the fact that they didn't get the presidency. That's the truth. That's the truth. Let's not kid ourselves here. Let's not joke around. Like, Zimbabwe's constitution was fine with Canada up until 2008 because it was a bourgeois constitution. It's a bourgeois constitution. It's not a constitution where the socialist or communist party is enshrined in the constitution. It's given a leading role, and other parties are just kind of consultative. So, like, basically the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the ideal system in my view. It's not that. It's not that. Mugabe was never a Marxist. Never was. He was, a bourgeois nationalist, an ethno-nationalist in a lot of ways.
Surprisingly, actually, on top of that, but
he's kind of like Saddam, where he kind of went rogue because he had to go rogue at some point. That's actually what that is. That's actually what he is.
And is the reason why the sanctions are still in place even when the military overthrew Mugabe and sacked him? Is the reason why the sanctions are still in place is because whoever I don't know who's in charge of who's the current president.
Gangagwa, and actually this guy was the one that led the army in the attack on the village of Joshua Nkoma. So yeah.
And are the sanctions still in place because he still is continuing land reform and whatnot, or what?
So the land is enshrined in the Constitution. They got that through. That's part of that's what legitimizes ZANU-PF in a way to the people.
And that's why the sanctions are still in place then.
Well, the sanctions by Canada are about the military base.
Okay.
So it's about the military base. They're not getting the access. They're not able to, directly control what's going on with the minerals. And the U.S. as a NATO ally is not able to, hold other capitals at gunpoint like they can in Botswana. So that guy agreed. That guy agreed to do it in Botswana. And they're holding them at gunpoint. It's a 2-minute sortie to reach Cape Town, by the way. It's only 2 minutes from a fighter jet from where they are in Botswana to Cape Town. And that's something that was pointed out by Julius Malema of the Economic Freedom Fighters. So like, this is what they wanted. They wanted a good sortie distance to South Africa, which is part BRICS, by the way. This is something that can't be forgotten. part of BRICS, supported was initially supported by the Soviet Union, supported by Russia today, and refused to condemn, incidentally. They voted. They they abstained in a key vote that.
Uh-oh.
Russia wanted support because if they just abstained, it would just make it easier for the votes against to stack up against them. So they said basically an abstain was the same as voting against. But South Africa abstained. They're kind of like it's a social democratic party, right? So they waver at key points. But they have a good relationship with Russia otherwise.
Interesting.
And it comes from that history.
And
yeah.
As we wrap up, very briefly, if it's possible, what is the state of the Black Lives Matter movement, the racial justice anti-police movement in Canada? Specifically, has the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, are they starting to speak out more on Canadian imperialism, anti-black, anti-indigenous policies overseas, and advocating abolishing the military and Canada's secret services? And if not, why do you think that is? And then the follow-up question to that is, what do you think it's going to take for Black people in the U.S. and other people power groups to show more solidarity to the Native Americans and other indigenous groups, Native Hawaiians and indigenous Alaskans?
So what I think is going to help all of these movements is the Ford Foundation money needs to come out. Like, it needs to be removed, and they need to give back the checks. If they don't give back the checks, then these movements will stay the way they are. That's one thing that can help. I know it's tempting to take that $1 million, $10 million, $20 million, but they're buying you. So I mean, if you have principles and you care about these things honestly, I know Patrice Kula's, she got a lot of houses, but at the same time, you're supposed to have principles, because if you don't, then Fox News is just gonna air that over and over again, and it's gonna be true. There's gonna be some truth to it.
Are the Black racial justice anti-police movement, are they still reluctant speaking out against Canadian imperialism and Canadian anti-Black, anti-indigenous policies overseas?
Well, I think anyone that's taking money from the government is definitely going to be hesitant. If they're taking grants, government grants, and this and that, and Ford money, of course, the Ford Foundation money, all these other big slush funds for corrupting independent movements. Yeah, that's obviously going to make it hard to point out what the government is doing abroad. But I think when people are able to make an independent movement and an independent political movement with the goal of seizing political power, a Marxist-Leninist style, and then it'll be better.
And then finally, I have to ask this: what do you think it's going to take for our fellow Black leftists and other left people power groups to show more solidarity to the criminally overlooked and widely ignored and brutally suppressed Native Americans, indigenous Hawaiians, and Native Alaskans?
Well, I think there just needs to be more, internal security. I think more internal security, ejecting liberalism, ejecting the CIA agents, the CSIS agents, all those conspiracies, and of course the foundation money, government money's got to go. That's the trick. That's actually the trick.
I certainly don't disagree with you on that. But even the best anti-imperialist and independent anti-imperialist movements and media outlets in the U.S. don't show solidarity. It's not even really even in the consciousness of people, the solidarity towards Native Americans, unlike Black Lives Matter and the different people power groups, broadly the broad church of the Canadian left. You don't see the kind of solidarity or even coverage of the plight of Indigenous people in the U.S. compared to Canada, which is which is why I asked what's it going to take for the people power movements in the U.S., which are great on Palestine solidarity, Black Lives Matter, Latinx Lives Matter, even Puerto Rico, even the plight of Puerto Rican people, and anti-imperialism. You don't see, like, those movements are big and robust, but when it comes to solidarity towards Native Americans, it's just not at the level as it is in in Canada or New Zealand, and to an extent Australia.
Well, that's rooted in the fact that they're supposed to do loyalty oaths every morning, like the children. There's this big movement by governors to get rid of critical race theory, and it's a movement that's popularized, and the underlying reason for that is because there was a trend, that an alarming trend that their mass surveillance state has been using to discover, is that there are a worryingly growing amount of people that are learning the actual history, and they're learning this history, and they're getting contemptible precisely because of the crimes against the Indigenous and the crimes against Africans, and they're putting it together. They're putting it together and making it into a more. So it's going to be more concerted. The U.S. is the muscle of NATO. That's its goal. That's its job. It's to be the muscle of NATO, and so it's important that they have soldiers for that are motivated to fight for a myth. So they have to make sure the myth continues. So the crimes that were committed, particularly by the founding fathers and every president thereafter against the Indigenous and Africans put together, and making that connection of the crimes together, will eradicate that myth completely. So that's what that is. So they're still making them say loyalty oaths, covering up the history, all of this stuff, and it's precisely because they need soldiers to fight for a myth.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, one can only hope that that the U.S. left gets to the level. This is the only time I'm complimentary about Canada, but one can only hope that the U.S. left does get to the level that the Canadian left is showing solidarity to Indigenous people.
What I would say is, in the U.S., the Black Lives Matter movements, there was a large contingent of them that were of the mind to destroy the country entirely.
Yeah.
And that's actually farther along politically in consciousness than Canada is. So in my opinion,
Canada, a kind of gentler machine gun hand.
So my opinion is,
who is a Canadian.
So my opinion is, I think the thing that really helps with consciousness is conditions, and the conditions in the U.S. are much worse for most people. That, and also I think eventually, when it becomes very clear and very obvious, like especially with this critical race theory thing, and all the other things that they're doing to try to cover up the history, and also to demonize and gaslight about socialist states. So when people become more conscious of what the government is doing and why, then I think my thing is, if I was betting which country would break through first, I'd say the U.S. breaks through first, just because they're backed into a corner, and because it'll get so obvious. It'll get so obvious at some point that people will just say, you know what, this teacher is just not telling me the truth. And when it gets to that point, that's actually when the revolutions start. In the universities and in the schools, the high schools, it's when the kids have enough consciousness to say, listen, this teacher is not telling me the truth at all. He's just lying to me about this history. It's all BS.
Well, one can only hope. Power to the people, death to settler colonialism and racial capitalism, especially towards the indigenous people. Well, we were joined on this edition of. No. Before we close, we usually close the show by doing the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later Bernard Pivot, and later James Lipton, the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Christian, it's your turn to do this before I let you enjoy the rest of the evening. So here it goes. Christian, what is your favorite word?
My favorite word, revolution.
What is your least favorite word?
Submission.
What turns you on spiritually, creatively, or emotionally?
Cooperation.
What turns you off?
Individualism.
What sound or noise do you love?
Firing squad.
Okay, then what sound or noise do you hate then?
Anthony Blinken.
What's your favorite curse word?
Favorite curse word.
And it could be in any language, by the way.
Damn.
Huh?
Damn.
Okay.
Damn. It's very.
Okay.
Damn.
Okay. What profession, if you weren't doing the activism on the side, musician, or whatever it is you do, what profession would you love to attempt?
Oh, you mean other than what I'm doing right now?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just once, maybe I would like to just try acting, just to see how it is. Just to act in one film.
Okay. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Anthony Blinken's secretary.
I feel the exact same thing about Justin Trudeau or even Obama. And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive to the pearly gates, or whatever is the vision of the afterlife you believe in? And even if you don't believe in, but you might be proven wrong, what would you like to see the deity say as you arrive to the afterlife?
Well, I would like my deities to come and say to me, you fought for your people, you did well.
And you do fight for your people, and you do well for all of humanity. We were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Christian Shingiro of the Canada Files. I'm also going to link to his wonderful YouTube page where people can check out his music and his interviews with great guests like Dimitri Lascaris, Arnold August, and Daniel G. Christian, this was a brilliant conversation. I definitely have to have you back on in the future to talk more about our continent of Africa. My mother is from the Congo, so it's great to talk to somebody else about the continent. Keep doing the great work you're doing, and I look forward to having you back in the future.
Sure.